Hi, it's a pleasure to speak with you today, and I like to begin these talks by having a bit more of an introduction to myself, just to, show some pictures of my research and what I'm about. So this is a photo of me in Iceland. So I work on volcanic fields in both Earth and Mars. So wherever there's a volcano, I'm happy to go there. But as a professor at Brock University, I also bring students out in the field with me, and here's a picture of me with a couple of undergraduates in Central Oregon. This is a volcanic field called Fort Rock. But I also am a mom, and I have two kids. My son Levi is a space nut. He loves to talk about the solar system and dress up like an astronaut. And my daughter Amity is 6, and she absolutely loves rocks and crystals, and she's always has her head down looking through gravel and looking for the perfect gem. Okay, so let's talk about Mars and why we go to Mars. Why do we spend all this money and send robots to Mars? Well, the big underlying question is, can we find evidence that life occurred outside of the Earth? So here's why Mars is a good place to look for this. This is a plot of stars. So we have a small star at the bottom going up to larger stars. And our sun is a very average sized star. And trending away from this are the planets of our solar system. And this shows how distance increases away, and where we know life exists and is very happy is on Earth. And in blue, this represents what we think is a likely habitable zone, habitable zones around different stars. And you can see that Mars just sits right outside this habitable zone. Venus is much too hot. Mars is right here. And the question is, could Mars have possibly been within that habitable zone at some point in its history? So if we look at the two planets side by side, there's a couple really big differences that jump out at you. The first being that Mars is much smaller. It's about 2/3 the size of the Earth. And then the other difference, of course, is that there's lots of this blue stuff on Earth, liquid water, whereas on Mars, today there is no liquid water on the surface. Okay, so size is important, and I'm going to talk about that to start. So Mars, so the Earth has this thing called a magnetic field. Okay, so what is shown here is are the magnetic field lines that basically form a protective shield for the Earth and protect us from solar radiation. And this is one big reason why life is able to thrive on Earth, is that we have this shield. So what generates this magnetic field on Earth is what's called a dynamo, and that is located within the Earth's outer core. And the Earth's outer core is made up of liquid metal iron that is convecting and stirring around, and that generates a magnetic field. So Mars today does not have a magnetic field, but there is some indication that in the past, when Mars was much hotter and maybe it had a liquid core at some point, a liquid part of the core at some point, we see indication within the rocks that in the past, Mars may have had a magnetic field and may have at one point had this sort of a shield. And then the other big difference, of course, is the water that I pointed out. And so what you're looking at here is what's called a phase diagram for water. Okay, so what is plotted here is pressure versus temperature. And we know on Earth that water can exist in 3 different phases. It can be ice, it can be liquid water, or it can be a gas. And so on Earth, we know the freezing point very well at this pressure. And this is the temperature where you go back and forth between freezing and liquid. And then if you heat it up, you go into what's the to the boiling point where water turns into a gas. So the atmospheric pressure of Mars is actually much lower than on Earth. And so it occupies a different space in this diagram. So the atmospheric pressure of Mars is around here, and it's right here. It was called the triple point, where ice, liquid water, and gas exist all together. But there's no big field for liquid water. And in fact, when you have ice on Mars, it will tend to go directly into a gas phase and skip the liquid today. Okay, so there is water ice on Mars. It is found at the poles, and you can actually see the ice caps of Mars today from a telescope if you have a really good telescope on Earth. Okay, but the thing is that in the past we think that Mars had a thicker atmosphere, and that means that the atmospheric pressure was much greater, and we think that there was a time when this liquid region, this area where liquid is stable, could have existed on Mars. And we do see evidence of that from orbit. So for example, here we see canyons, we see stream channels, and all sorts of things that are imaged from orbit to indicate that at some point in the past, there was abundant liquid water on Mars. Okay, so the strategy for studying Mars has been to, send orbiters to Mars to take pictures of the surface, but also there are these robotic explorers. And the first robotic exploring I'm going to talk about are the Mars exploration rovers. There are two of these that were sent, and these were sent to find evidence of past water in the rocks. These rovers, this rover was sort of the rover that everything else was built on, in that there's some commonalities. So this rover has 6 wheels. The other 2 rovers I'm going to talk about, Curiosity and Perseverance, also have 6 wheels, and that's necessary to get around, of course, as it's a rover. It also has a mast, and on that mast it has cameras. So it has cameras, a left and a right eye camera, to be able to see in 3 dimensions, so we can get stereo images. And then the other thing that it has are solar panels for power. And then it has a high gain antenna to be able to communicate with orbiting spacecraft around Mars, as well as to communicate with us on Earth. And then also it has an arm on it with a suite of instruments for looking at rocks up close and looking at chemistry and mineralogy. Okay, so these rovers, I was fortunate to be a postdoc on this mission. This is really where I got my start as a Mars geologist. And so this is a picture of me with this, with a test bed rover at the Jet Propulsion Lab in California. You can get a sense for its size. I couldn't stand right up close to it, but it's like the size of a small golf cart. And there were 2 rovers that were constructed. The first was a Spirit rover, and it was sent to a place called Jezreel Crater. It was sent here because looking for evidence of water, they looked at the shape and surface of Mars and saw that there was this large canyon system and stream channel that empties out into Jezreel Crater. And if we were going to look for a place where liquid water could exist, this is a good candidate for that. The second rover that was sent is the Opportunity rover. It was sent to Meridiani Planum. This area is relatively featureless, except from orbit we were able to see lots and lots of the mineral hematite. So hematite is an iron oxide mineral that is essentially rust, and it forms in the presence of water. Okay, so it's an oxidized iron that forms in the presence of water. And so if we're looking for evidence of past water, then the mineralogy should tell us something as well. Okay, so Spirit landed in 2004, and it was active until about 2010. When it first landed in this region in Jezreel Crater, it actually encountered a lot of lava rocks, which did not give much indication about evidence of past water. However, things got really exciting when we started to explore more. And what we found was that we got to this area called Home Plate. This is an outcrop of rock. It's about 80 meters across, and you can see all the places that the rover drove around it. But what we found here were layered rocks that are interpreted to be pyroclastic rocks. So rocks where we have an interaction, we have explosive volcanic deposits. And we see indication that the explosions actually involved a good deal of ground or surface water to create it. Okay, so these rocks are very similar to rocks that I've seen in Nevada and Oregon, as well as Hawaii, where you have this explosive interaction between water and magma. And the biggest indicator, or not the biggest indicator, but one that's the most easily recognized is this feature right here that I'm circling on this outcrop. And here's what it looks like on Mars. You can see that there's this larger clast. This clast is about, or this rock included within the rock, it is about 3 centimeters across. And you can see that the underlying layers, are deformed around it. And what this suggests is that these rocks were, these layers were cohesive when this larger rock impacted it and fell into it. Okay, and so the fact that they were once cohesive suggests that there was once abundant water within these sediments. And we interpret this to have formed by some sort of a pyroclastic, so explosive volcanic process. Here is a picture from New Mexico, where we see a similar kind of feature. Here is a clast, what we call bomb, and it has deformed the underlying layers in a similar kind of way. So this is called a bomb sack, and it is diagnostic of these kinds of eruptions. So we found evidence for water, which was great. The other evidence of water that we saw there was in the mineralogy, and so this is one example of this. This is an area where we found hydrated iron sulfates, and this is actually the final resting spot for the Spirit rover. It got stuck in the slippery soil here, and you can see that the soil's all churned up. But most of the soil around this area is sort of reddish to blackish, whereas here it's this bright white. And there's even some areas where there's yellow. And how we interpret that this happened is that we think that it was a place where we have high temperature water rock interaction, where fumaroles were actually venting close to the surface and then forming minerals around those vents. So here's an example of fumaroles on Volcano in Italy. Okay, then the Spirit opportunity, excuse me, let me start over. The Opportunity rover was sent to a very different location from the Spirit rover. And this rover was actually active from up until 2018. So it had a really good long life of exploring Mars. And in this area, it encountered a lot of layered sedimentary rocks. And there's evidence that they were deposited by water, and that water percolated through pores within the sediments. So what you can see here are these layered, this layered rock that is really very indicative of being laid down by water. It's fine grained. And when we looked up close to it, you can see that this is a microscopic image of the rock. And within these rocks, there are these features that are very spherical. And these are interpreted to be, well, we call them blueberries because they look like blueberries within a blueberry muffin. And what we found was that these blueberries contain abundant hematite within them. And hematite forms in rocks on Earth in a similar kind of way as concretions. And what this is that you have iron oxide forming around sort of a seed crystal in this spherical way within the rock itself. And it is formed in the presence of water. And this is really good evidence that water actually percolated through these rocks and formed these minerals. There are other kinds of features that we see within the opportunity rocks in Meridiani Planum that indicate that water was once present. So here is a rock that you can see that there's these blueberries scattered around. There's sort of these darker blue colors. And then the rock itself, you can see these sort of marks throughout it. And what those are when we look up close is that you can see that there are these features here that are interpreted to be crystal casts. So at one time, there were crystals of what we think were probably gypsum, you know, gypsum as sheetrock. So gypsum forming within these rock layers, and then later on being dissolved away. And this occurs on Earth. Here's an example of crystal casts in rocks on Earth as a good analog. And so we understand how these features form on Earth as well as on Mars. So the next rover that I'm going to talk about is the Curiosity Rover. The Spirit and Opportunity rovers were a big success, and the Curiosity rover sort of builds on that success. And the objective of this mission is to explore and assess a region on Mars's surface as a potential habitat for life present, or a life past or present. So we want to understand the biological potential, the geology and geochemistry, the water, weather, and climate, as well as measuring the radiation levels at the surface. So this rover is bigger. It is the size of a large SUV. You can get a sense of the 6 wheels that it contains. The height of those are basically up to my kneecap. And the arm on this rover, if you think about the instrument suite that is at the end of this arm, it sort of zigzags here. This is about the size of a lawnmower, like the base of a lawnmower. So it's this big suite of instruments that we've carried along to Mars. So where was the Curiosity rover sent? It was sent to Jezreel Crater. And this place is interesting for a number of reasons. The first is its location. So this is an image that shows the elevation of the surface of Mars that is color coded, so that the high parts of Mars are shown in reds and yellows, and then the lower areas are shown in darker blues and purples and even white. And you can see here that the Jezreel Crater in the northern part of Jezreel Crater is actually one of the lowest regions in this area. So in this picture, you can see that the southern part of Mars actually has a very high topography to it, and we refer to that as being the southern highlands of Mars. And then there's this northern area. These are the northern lowlands. And you can see that the northern lowlands have fewer craters on it. So that means that it's probably younger than the southern highlands. And if there was ever an ocean on Mars, which is highly debated, the northern lowlands would be the area where that would have existed. But you can see here that if there was surface water on Mars, and the fact that Jezreel Crater is so deep that water would most likely collect within this region. Okay, so this is an area where we were looking for evidence of possibly a past lake. Another thing that's interesting about Jezreel Crater is that it has a mountain in the middle of it. It contains a 5-kilometer high mound of layered rock, and the layers in the lower section vary in mineralogy and texture and suggest that they may have recorded environmental changes over time. And so what we see is that there's a lot of clays in the lower levels, and then it varies up into more sulfate-rich minerals towards the top of this. And what we think is that early on in Mars history, there was indications of more neutral, possibly more favorable to life kinds of conditions. And then the upper levels of Mount Sharp, because there's a lot of sulfate present, suggests that it could have experienced more acidic conditions, so possibly less favorable to life. So what did we find? We found lots. We're still exploring Jezreel Crater, but a lot of what we see are these layered rocks, and so we see layered rocks that are dipping from the crater rim towards the center, which suggests some sort of water-laying deposition. These rocks are very, very fine grain, which suggests that they were deposited in a lake-like setting. We also see these crystals within the rock in some areas. These are interpreted to be a little class of gypsum within the rock, and this suggests that water deposited these crystals during evaporation. And so this is reminiscent of the kinds of crystal casts that we saw with the Opportunity rover in Meridiani Planum. We also see spherules within the mudstones, so the fine-grained rocks. We see these rounded, darker blotches within here. These are reminiscent of the blueberries in Meridiani Planum, but they're not quite the same. Some of them are hematite, some of them just seem to be places where there's a higher concentration of cementing agent within the rock. And but they're scattered around, and that is really good evidence that water percolated through pores within this rock. The other thing that you can see in this image are these white lines that are cutting through it. And what this suggests is that the rock fractured and that water ran through those fractures and then deposited minerals there. And those are also the mineral gypsum. So we interpret Jezreel Crater having once been filled in by a lake. We see evidence of stream channels that sort of cut across the rim, and we think that at one time Jezreel Crater was basically a catchment for water in the region to deposit these layered sediments. Okay, so now moving on to Perseverance. This is the exciting one. This is the Mars 2020 mission. It's exciting because Perseverance has only recently landed in February, and we're still getting to know this rover. We're still getting to know the local vicinity. And of course you want to know how Perseverance is different. Perseverance looks an awful lot like Curiosity, doesn't it? It has the 6 wheels, it's a similar size. It is powered by nuclear energy, but it has some pretty fundamental differences to it. And you can see possibly the biggest difference is here. One of the biggest differences is that the objective of the Perseverance rover is to actually find evidence of past life. So we're no longer looking for a habitable environment. We're looking for a place where life could have existed, and hopefully we'll be able to bring samples of Mars back to Earth. And how are we doing that? This rover has a drill on it that is going to collect samples and contain them within these cylinders. And we have enough space to collect about 30 samples, about 20 of which will be returned to Earth, hopefully, if everything goes according to plan. And we'll collect these samples that can be returned to Earth and then analyzed within our terrestrial laboratories. So Earth-based laboratories. And the reason for doing that is that a rover can really only do so much with these samples or with rocks on Mars. In order to really look for evidence of life and past life, we need to bring them back to Earth. Okay, so how is this going to happen? The idea is that there's going to, in the future, be a lander that is going to be sent to Mars, that is going to deploy a rover, and that rover is called the Fetch rover. So it's going to go and fetch the samples that are going to be dropped by the Perseverance rover onto the surface of Mars. So a Fetch rover is going to collect those samples and then bring them back to the Mars lander. And then there's going to be a Mars ascent vehicle that is going to actually launch those samples into orbit around Mars. And then eventually they'll be collected from orbit by an orbiter spacecraft. And that orbiter may involve humans in the loop. We aren't totally sure whether or not that's going to happen or not. But the idea is that there's going to be some sort of an orbiter that's going to collect those samples and bring them back to Earth. And so the reason for going through all this is that we want to find evidence of past life, but also in order to look for evidence of past life, you want to have a well-characterized set of samples from an area on Mars where we think life once could have existed. Before I move on to the area that Perseverance was sent, I just wanted to point out the Ingenuity helicopter, which is a very exciting component of the Perseverance rover mission. And I'll talk about that and show some videos of the Perseverance, of the Ingenuity helicopter. Okay, so where was Perseverance sent? Perseverance was sent here. Remember what I mentioned earlier, that there's the southern highlands of Mars that have all these craters on them. And then there's the northern lowlands of Mars that don't have quite as many craters. And the Perseverance rover is sent here right at the edge of this southern highlands, northern lowlands, to a place called Jezreel Crater. And we see lots of evidence of water interaction at this margin between the southern highlands and northern lowlands. At Jezreel Crater in particular, what we see is that this is Jezreel Crater. Of particular interest is this feature here. Okay, so what we see is that there's a stream channel that empties into Jezreel Crater. And we see this platform here. And this platform is actually layered sediments. This is what's called a delta. And deltas form on Earth where you have sediments that are carried by a river and then are deposited where that water slows down. And that slows down at a lake or an ocean. So this is why sediments build up around the mouth of the Mississippi River, forming the Louisiana Delta, okay, Mississippi Delta. So this is a delta deposit that we think, so this is good evidence that Jezreel once hosted a lake at one time. Also, that we should be able to find lake sediments here, as well as sediments that formed from, that were carried from upstream. The other feature that's interesting is that there's an outflow channel as well. So we know that water collected here and that it drained away, okay? And it drained into those those northern highlands, the northern lowlands of Mars. So this rover was launched in July of 2020. It was launched in the middle of the pandemic, and I don't think any of us expected that the pandemic would last quite as long as it has. We kept feeling like it was going to be over by the time it actually landed, but of course not. It was launched, and the reason why it was sent is that there's a very narrow period of time when the orbits of Earth and Mars are lined up very well, and that shortens the journey and allows us to send spacecraft to Mars. And in fact, lots of other, there have been several other countries that have sent spacecraft to Mars recently. So for example, China sent a rover recently. Also, the United Arab Emirates sent their first orbiter to Mars, which is very exciting. So this is the journey. It took about 6 months for this rover to get there. And again, it's just that we have to make sure that those orbits are well lined up. And if we miss this launching opportunity, it would not happen until 2024. So how did we land? So what happened is that the spacecraft entered the Mars atmosphere, and it was slowed down a little bit by what's called this heat shield. It came in at an angle, and it has this heat shield to sort of slow it down a little bit. And then it deployed a supersonic parachute. Once the parachute was deployed, it was able to slow down some more, and the rover could actually drop off that heat shield and get an image of the landing area. As it was coming in for a landing, this rover was actually super smart. It was able to actually pick out a safe area to land, and it picked it out. It looked for a very smooth area with few rocks. And then once it locked into it, what happened is that it deployed this parachute, and the parachute was left to drift away and crash land elsewhere. And then the rover basically found its way to Jezreel Crater. It was lowered by a tether by this feature called the sky crane. And then once it landed, that sky crane took off and crash landed safely away from the rover itself. And of course, we were all very excited. This is an emotional day for many people to watch this rover being to land on Mars. And when that rover first landed, maybe you saw this picture. This is our first look of Mars. It's not super exciting, right? But it's the easiest one for us to see. This is a picture from a hazard avoidance camera located underneath the rover itself. You can see that, and it also has this halo around it. This is a dust cover, which is a protective cover. This has since been removed. And here's a hazard, the hazard avoidance camera with that dust cover removed in color. So you can see the wheels on the ground and the shadow from the rover itself, which is really nice to see. When we first saw these pictures, I remember thinking, yeah, this looks very familiar. This looks like Mars. And it was almost like, you know, going home, but in a different place. Once the rover's mast was fully operational, we took a 360-degree full color panorama of the landing site, and this is what you see here. It's also what's behind me in the Zoom call. And you can see these areas here. These are actually the blast zones from that sky crane. So the reverse thrusters, as they were sort of lowering the rover down, they shot out some really compressed air. And it blasted into the substrate and exposed some bedrock in some cases. And then you can see that the rover looks pretty distorted here. That's just a function of how this panorama was put together. But off in the distance, this is actually the delta in the distance. So we got a nice, good look of the delta straight away. What do the rocks look like up close? Well, we're actually still figuring out what these rocks are. There's a healthy debate going on about whether or not these are sedimentary or igneous rocks. What we see is that we're taking images of these rocks. We're still getting used to the geochemical instruments, the mineralogical instruments, and so we will start to measure these rocks more and more as we go and have a better picture of what these things are. Where did we land? We landed at this area here. So here's the delta itself. And this rover landed here at a site that has been named the Octavia E. Butler landing site. Octavia E. Butler is a really great science fiction writer. And we tend to name landing sites after people in literature, actually. So the Curiosity landing site was actually named after Ray Bradbury. I've since read a couple of Octavia E. Butler's books, and I highly recommend them. They're really interesting. And so this is the site, and this is their area that we're exploring now. There's this region here, Sita, it's been named Sita, that is a lower lying region. And we are seeing whether or not we can go into Sita. The first thing that we did, though, was to go a little bit north to deploy the helicopter. And so there was a time where we really focused on ingenuity. And so this is actually a selfie image taken by the rover itself. And you can see the helicopter was deployed on the ground of Mars, and then it was allowed to fly, which was a very exciting part of this mission. This helicopter was basically a proof of concept, where we've never previously flown another spacecraft or another planet, so we wanted to show that it could be done. The atmosphere of Mars is much sorry. The atmosphere of Mars is much lower pressure, so that just complicates things. Okay, so and this helicopter is not expected to last very long, but it's been hugely successful. And so here is the first flight that Ingenuity was able to make. And so that first flight was just a, go up and then go back down, but it's an exciting thing to see. The third flight, we've since had 6 flights, I believe. Here's a picture. This is the third flight. This is actually a picture that was taken by Ingenuity itself. And you can see off in the corner, there is Perseverance. And there it is. It's kind of cool that that Ingenuity has been able to image the rover, and they're able to communicate with one another. Here's a movie that was taken during the 4th flight. You can see the shadow of Ingenuity on the surface of Mars as it's flying. And there's the 5th flight. Sort of a nice picture of Ingenuity off in the distance. So now that we've been able to demonstrate that Ingenuity is going to be helpful for future missions, the idea is that helicopter might be able, a similar kind of helicopter would be able to help future human exploration of Mars. Now it's time for the Perseverance rover to really get going, and it's going to explore Jezreel Crater. Here is a view of the region. This is Santa Cruz, which is a hill that's about 1.5 kilometers from the rover. And you can see that the landscape here is actually just littered with these rocks. There's lots of boulders. for Perseverance to have to move around. Some of them are kind of sharp, so we'll have to be careful not to run into those. And so it's going to be a little slow going at first until we move through areas that aren't quite so so rubbly. And we're also getting up close pictures of rocks. So this is a microscopic image of a rock, and so these are nested images to just sort of show you what these rock textures are looking like. And we're, like I said, we're still trying to understand how these rocks formed. So the idea now is that the rover is actually going to drive south around Sita, get some really good views into Sita, possibly descend into Sita, and then we're going to decide where the first sample is going to be taken from. And so it's very likely that the sample will come from what's known as the fractured unit, the crater floor fractured unit, which is this sort of feature here, but we're still figuring out where that sample is going to come from. So we're going to be basically testing out capabilities, but also we want to use that sample in order to possibly date a surface of Mars. Okay, so now I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Mariek, I'll start with a couple. Have you ruled out any of that erosion based on wind as opposed to water, or you think it's all water erosion, or can some of it be wind, or a combination of both? And my second question.
Can I answer that one first?
Sure.
Okay, so the surface of Mars today is really dominated by wind action, and so you can see there are these bed forms here. These are basically these are like mini dunes. You can see little things here. These are little ripples that are formed by wind. So wind definitely happens, but and so wind is the main thing that's been going on for probably 1 billion years on Mars. But prior to that, the surfaces of Mars, we see stream channels that those can't form by wind. They really can only form by water.
And my second question is, back where you had that shot, there's a lot of what I'm going to call pockmarks and holes. So was Mars more susceptible to, that was it, take it back to space debris and or meteorites and that hitting Mars? Is it like going to be much more dangerous than Earth?
Oh, you're trying like this one? Where you can see all these pockmarks here? Yeah.
Well, you had a shot that looked like holes, looked like spots on Mars where things hit it and created the small holes or small craters.
Yeah, that's exactly how those features form, by impacts. Okay, and there are lots of these features around. So here you can look at this surface of Mars. So these are volcanoes out here, these large features, but like this one's a really big impact, but just sort of distributed around here. And the reason why we see more impact craters on Mars as opposed to the Earth is that erosion is much less on Mars, so that older surfaces are preserved. So on Earth, we have a lot of water that erodes the surface. We also have biological activity that erodes the rock and puts, ground cover everywhere. And the other thing that Earth has that Mars does not have is plate tectonics. And what plate tectonics does is it recycles the crust of Earth down into the interior and then brings it back up. And so what that means then is that the surface of Mars is much, much older than that of the Earth. So the fact that we see more craters is just basically a result of that it's an older surface. And it's like when we look at the moon is covered with craters.
Yeah.
And those craters are, it's just that it's an older surface. There's no erosion on the moon either. Good questions. Thank you.
Mary, could I ask a question? Ron Castleman. Given that the idea that life started on Earth, say 3.5 billion years ago, early cells, is it real? You have never used the word fossils. I guess we don't know if there actually are fossils on Mars of early life forms. I'm just thinking that is the history of Mars going to be similar to Earth in that we had multiple extinctions of early life that started and it never did evolve on Mars?
We don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's possible that life never existed on Mars, but I think that there is good indication that possibly it could have, because there was abundant liquid water at one time. The conditions were at one time more neutral, possibly more favorable to life. If there was a magnetic field at one time on Mars, then possibly life could have been more likely to exist. So right now, it's an open question, and it's really driving exploration of this planet.
Are all the normal chemicals for life, like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, do you think they're all on Mars?
Yep, we've been able to detect all of them.
Yeah.
Yep. And all the fundamental building blocks of life are found there. It's just that we don't see evidence of, macroorganisms, right? So I think that it's possible that there are microorganisms, and it'll be a challenge to identify the fossils basically for that.
Will you be able to actually determine if there actually are fossils like in stratified layers of rock similar to the Earth, or is that going to be difficult?
Well, okay, so one type of fossil that we think we might be able to identify that's a macro fossil, so one that you can actually see with your eye, as opposed to a micro fossil, which would be something we would need in a microscope.
Yeah.
Might be something like, and those form on Earth by basically algal mats, so mats of algae that are some of the oldest fossils that we have on Earth. And so possibly we'll see something like that, but we need to find them first.
Yeah.
So there's even oxygen on Mars.
Yeah. I mean, not free oxygen. The atmosphere is different, right?
Yeah.
But you have to keep in mind that oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere was not abundant in the early stages of Earth's history. And it was really only biology that led to the formation of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. So that's not free oxygen in the atmosphere is not a requirement. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to ask about temperatures. Have you noted anything about temperatures on Mars?
Yeah, so it gets down to about minus 92 degrees C at night. So the nights are very, very cold. And then around daytime, it can hover around 0 to 10 degrees C. And so some days it actually is warmer on the surface of Mars than it is in, say, Catharines. So, there are these big shifts in temperature daily. And so that's something that the rover and any spacecrafts have to contend with, are those big shifts in temperature.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. I've seen these photographs that Ron Joseph has been showing that are very convincing, that show from day to day changes in what he's calling fungus. And I'm wondering what you think about all of that, and is he faking those shots that show things changing in the same place, or why are things changing that you would think would be constantly the same?
Oh, I'm not familiar with these images.
Oh,
So
okay.
I can't speak to them, but I will say that if there were fungus on Mars, I think we'd be able to identify them. And the other thing is that fungus is a pretty high level type of organism, that if we were going to find life on Mars, I don't think we would find a fungus. I think we'd be more likely to find a microbe.
Well, I think most people agree with you, but
Yeah.
his series of images are so convincing, where he sort of shows, well, there's 3, and now there's 4, and now there's 5, and
Oh, really? I haven't seen those.
This is Andy Redman. I have a slightly different question. I was looking at the 2 vehicles there, Curiosity and Perseverance. Perseverance appears to have fairly simple, straightforward tires, if I can use that expression, on the wheels, whereas Curiosity appears to have had some kind of sensors built into it. I wonder if you could explain that.
Okay. Where's a picture of Perseverance? Okay. So yeah, they do have different wheels. So these wheels on Curiosity, yeah, you can see this sort of zigzag pattern, and then there are these sort of holes within it, and those were meant to be able to record distance as they went, so they knew how much of a wheel turn, what the distance was involved with each wheel turn. The problem was that these wheels got really, really eaten up on the surface of Mars because the rocks are super sharp. And so if you look at some of the wheel images, they're available for you to look at online, that some of them have pretty big holes, pretty big holes from just being poked by rocks. And so the worry very early on in the mission was that we were going to actually lose the wheels. They're still going. We think those wheels are going to be good for a good long time. But the Perseverance rover, the wheels were completely redesigned to be more robust. And so yeah, it's a different kind of material. I'm not sure exactly what it is. They were redesigned to be stronger on Mars. I don't know anything.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Are there volcanoes actively on Mars erupting?
Not actively erupting. But there are some of the largest volcanoes in the solar system are located on Mars. That being the Olympus Mons volcano, and that volcano itself, it has a footprint that's about the same size as the state of Arizona, if you can believe it. And these things, yeah, they're huge volcanoes. We think that that volcanic eruptions, they could be possible in the future. And we think that possibly the most recent volcanic eruption was maybe 2 million years ago. So there's potential, probably not in our lifetime. Maybe it might take another 1 million years. But yeah, that it's possible that there could be another eruption.
John?
Just not today.
Go ahead, John.
I have a question. This is a very precious cargo that is loaded on Mars and through a series of incredible circumstances brought to Earth. What happens to it after it lands? You know, how does it, where does it go? How does it get opened? What are the conditions under which it is studied? Things like that.
Yeah, good question. Those are all things that are still being worked out. I think I forgot to mention that the time frame for its return is going to be 2034 currently. Okay, so yeah, so 2034, we're hoping to get them here. Those samples are going to be very carefully opened. There are new laboratories that are going to be, and curation facilities that will be constructed for those, probably at the Johnson Space Center, because that in Houston, Texas, because that is where the Apollo samples are located. And we also have some pretty precious other astromaterials that are located there. but some of that material will be sent to some other countries. For example, the ROM, Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, is going to receive some material as well to study and to have on display. So, so yeah, it's those, and then once they are returned, people who are interested in studying them are going to be able to write proposals to be able to analyze them. And yeah, it's going to be a very exciting.
If it takes that long, is
Yeah,
it going to
thank
be a
you.
whole new generation of scientists and yourselves that is going to have to be trained to work on this? Or
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's going to be a whole new generation of people that can work on these. And so, yeah, my students and my students will get to work on them. Yeah,
how
but it's
long does it-
exciting. And for in the meantime, though, we can continue to train on
how long does it
and
how long does it take you?
meteorites and other kinds of things that are being analyzed.
Sorry, with technology, how long does it take you to communicate between NASA or yourselves and Mars to get all this data? Does it take like a day to come back to you, or what?
Okay,
how
so
fast is it?
what happens? So the rover communicates directly with Earth once a day, and that occurs in the morning, and it takes about 7 minutes for the information to be relayed.
Ooh.
Okay, but it depends on where the rover is, or where Mars is relative to the Earth in terms of our relative orbits. But the other way that the rover actually communicates with Earth is by communicating with orbiters. So there are several orbiters that are orbiting Mars currently. And so what the rover does is when there is an orbiter that is in the sky above it, it can send data directly to that orbiter that basically collects it and then transmits it back to Earth.
Anything else, gentlemen and ladies? Okay, hearing none. Duncan, can I get you to thank our speaker, please?
Yep, just unmute.